It's a world premiere of 3 one-act operas. The opera features the music of 3 different Iowa composers, and it was commissioned by the Cedar Rapids Opera Theatre. The opera, called the Grant Wood Operas, Strokes of Genius, showcases the life of Iowa artist Grant Wood. I'm Jacqueline Hallblum for the Iowa Art Showcase, and the 3 Iowa composers that each created their own act were Robert Lindsay Nassif, Jean-Francois Charles, and Michael Ching. Also included in this Cedar Rapids Opera Theatre production is author of Grant Wood, A Life, Tripp Evans. Dr. Evans received his doctorate in art history from Yale, and currently he is professor of art history at Wheaton College in Massachusetts and has been visiting lecturer at Yale and Brown universities, as well as Wellesley College. And Tripp Evans, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Well, how exciting, an opera about Grant Wood and an opera centered around one or more of Grant Wood's paintings. And the composers were told that they were supposed to use Grant Wood paintings as inspiration for their libretto and their music. So you are a Grant Wood expert, and in fact, you are on the Grant Wood Art Colony Board through the University of Iowa. Just tell us briefly what that is.
The Art Colony began a few years ago, primarily through the generosity of Jim Hayes, who is still our kind of leader on the board. And essentially, it's a colony that supports visiting artists in the spirit of Grant Wood's time at the University of Iowa. It's really been an extraordinary program that has really strengthened, I think, the arts at the University of Iowa, and has, I think, brought greater attention to the contributions that Grant Wood made, especially during his time there on the faculty.
So, Tripp, how did you get interested in Grant Wood and his life and his works?
Well, I think I may be one of the first non-Iowans to do a sustained study of his work, and I've often been asked that question in Iowa. It really started with a proposed article that I was going to be writing about Grant Wood's portrait of his mother, which is called Woman with Plants, and American Gothic, the painting that everyone knows. And once I really scratched the surface and saw a little bit more, read a little bit more about his family life and the relationships with those around him, I decided that a full biography might be a little bit more interesting to tackle. So that led to, several years of doing work in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City and other places in Iowa, Anamosa, really looking at the ways in which his life kind of informed his paintings.
I must compliment you on your book because it is so well annotated, and it's hard to read, not because it's not interesting, but because you keep on flipping back and looking at these different pictures and thinking about what you're saying. So it's a wonderful journey through the life of Grant Wood. So Grant Wood started out, and he had a lot of broad interests. He was drawing, he was painting, he made furniture, jewelry, all sorts of different things. So in fact, one of his first ventures was at a craft shop. So how did he finally gravitate from doing some metalworking and that sort of thing into painting, and why did he seem to be going that direction?
As you said, he really was a man of all trades. He did, interior decoration, he did theater work, set designs, worked with the community players, jewelry work, furniture making, as you mentioned. Painting was always important to him. I think from the time that he was a teenager, and then obviously throughout his life, he continued to paint initially in a very kind of impressionist style. And after high school, in a brief stint in Chicago, he was really studying the works at the Art Institute of Chicago and trying to figure out how he could get to Europe, because as a young painter, that was really kind of the goal. So he spent a number of summers, and one point actually an 18-month period in the 1920s, painting in Paris and in other parts of France. When he came back to Iowa, he would often sort of exhibit these works, but it wasn't really until he hit it so big with American Gothic in 1930 that he was really known beyond being just kind of a World's Fair painter, or a State Fair painter, I should say. And from that point forward, it really was entirely painting that kind of consumed him. Whereas before, I think there still was a question whether he would, turn into a furniture designer, a set designer. But from 1930 on, his mission kind of was clear.
Now, Wood was born and grew up on a farm, and his father passed away really suddenly when he was just 10 years old. And then he spent most of the rest of his life living with and supporting his mother and his sister Nan. So how did this affect his art and his life, really?
Well, I mean, the death of his father was really kind of the watershed moment of his life. He had lived on a kind of rural farm in Anamosa, outside of Anamosa, Iowa, until the age of 10. And after that, and after the move to Cedar Rapids, his life changed in all kinds of ways. Not only was he removed from kind of a farm setting to a city setting, but he was also very much encouraged by his mother to pursue his interest in art, which was a pursuit that his father had quite emphatically not supported. So, with the death of his father, there really is this kind of newfound kind of respect for and support for his work within the family. Now, growing up, and really until the death of his mother remained kind of a central figure in his life. They lived together most of his, early adult years until her death in 1935. And his sister Nan was always kind of a muse for him. She first shows up in the guise of an image of kind of mourning or victory in his memorial window in Cedar Rapids in the 1920s. And then most famously, she's his muse for the female figure in American Gothic. And, that relationship with his mother and with his sister is really exactly the kind of story that I started to kind of uncover early on in my work on Wood, which really fascinated me. So Nan and his mother Hattie were really central characters in his life.
And in his painting, as you were mentioning, they sort of turn into archetypes in his work.
Absolutely. I mean, you see his father kind of brooding over a lot of his paintings, and certainly his mother becomes kind of an Earth Mother figure. In fact, his sister even becomes a kind of archetype of, say, a young Persephone or a personification of Iowa farmland. I think part of that has to do with his growing up on a farm, as isolated as he was from other, kind of families and figures. His mother and his sister and his father, even the farmhand who worked with them, were, larger than life, I think, in his childhood imagination. And therefore, you end up seeing them playing kind of multiple roles in his works. It's really interesting to kind of chart how his sister kind of changes in the ways that he depicts her, and his mother as well. His father, he never actually painted, but continued to sort of provide kind of substitute figures for his father in his paintings. And indeed, when he was dying, one of his final wishes was that he would finally paint his father, and he never quite got there.
Well, you mentioned in your book how he never felt like he was really part of the family. He didn't look like his brothers, but when his sister Nan was born, he felt like, oh, I finally look like someone. I must be part of this family.
Yeah, he had such a special bond with Nan. He wasn't like his younger and slightly, he had an older brother and a younger brother, and both of them were very much athletically inclined, kind of gregarious, interested in cars. None of these were things that Grant Wood was interested in. When Nan was born, and she was, several years younger than he was, they really just kind of struck up a bond in childhood. Grant Wood was a very shy young man. I think Nan kind of supported him and gave him a sense of confidence. And he often spoke of himself, his mother, and Nan as we three. And those not, more familiar with his family might have imagined that it was just the three of them always. I think some are actually surprised to hear that he had other siblings, because it became this really closed loop of his mother and Nan and himself. And in fact, not only did he live with his mother into his 40s, but Nan lived with them as well. And Nan actually lived with them for a good long time, even after her own marriage. Her husband was being treated for tuberculosis, and she then moved in with her mother and Grant Wood. And mind you, they lived in a space that was about 800 square feet. This was not a large place, and it's where he did some of his most famous paintings.
Which is pretty amazing. If folks haven't been to the studio, they should definitely try to see the studio at some point, because it's an incredible place to visit. So tell us about his friendship with his classmate, Marvin Cohn, and this friendship lasted throughout his whole life.
Absolutely. He and Marvin Cohn went to high school together and graduated in the same senior class and remained good friends. Marvin Cohn had always been interested in painting as Grant Wood had been. And in fact, Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood went together on the first trip to Paris in 1920. And Marvin Cohn became, not just a confidant and a friend, but someone whose work I think Wood really admired. And if you look at Marvin Cohn's work, I think you can also see in some areas kind of the seeds for Grant Wood's own mature style. So I think they influenced one another. And certainly I can see Marvin Cohn's influence on Wood's work pretty early on. I think it was an extraordinarily close relationship, partly because of that bond through painting.
And I think you said in your book also that they went to Paris together at one time.
Yep. They went together to Paris in 1920 and studied, the classics at the Louvre. There was a side trip to the Netherlands where they studied the work of Flemish Baroque and Northern Renaissance masters. These are painters that would become really important to Wood later on in the later 20s when he was visiting Munich and seeing some of the same kinds of works at the Alto Pinakothek. And I think that it was Marvin Cohn's kind of probably more outgoing nature that allowed Wood to kind of branch out a bit on those trips to Europe.
Because you said that he was kind of a shy guy and had a hard time meeting people initially.
He was very shy, and it sounds strange given the fact that he lived when he did and was as famous as he was. I've never heard a single recording of his voice, but people talk about his voice in conjunction with talking about his shyness. They said that he spoke very, very slowly. They said sort of like, a telegraph kind of coming through in a sort of staccato way. I've never been able to quite figure out what that would have sounded like, but they said that he often was too bashful to meet you in the eye, and certainly painfully shy when he was growing up. He said that art really was his outlet. If it were not for sketching and painting, he really would have had no kind of emotional outlet.
So Grant Wood, many of his paintings have a humorous aspect to them. So was he doing this on purpose?
It depends on the painting. I think sometimes he really was intentionally making a kind of wry joke. He had a wonderful sense of humor. As shy as he was, his friends always talked about his kind of sense of wit and sense of humor. So if you think about, for example, his painting Daughters of Revolution that he did in the mid-1930s, it's an image of three older women in front of a painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware, Emanuel Leutze's famous painting. And it was a very, maybe not so subtle way to kind of make a dig at the daughters of the American Revolution. The DAR and Grant Wood had kind of a long-standing grudge that may be too long to get into here. But certainly when he created that painting showing these somewhat ridiculous-looking women holding their teacups very preciously, I think he really did intend to make kind of a joke at their expense. In some other paintings, like American Gothic, the public have often perceived a sense of humor that may or may not have been intentional. There's always been a debate about whether American Gothic is intended to parody this sort of farming couple, or if it's meant to be kind of a hymn of praise to them. And I think it's not quite either, in fact. And so sometimes the humor in his works, as I said, is more intentional than in others.
So in some of these works, he was really making subtle jabs at society.
Yeah, and I think that certain kind of East Coast critics often felt that their own, kind of caricatures of Midwestern types were being kind of flattered by what they perceived to be Grant Wood's, sort of poking fun of the types that he knew from growing up. But I genuinely believe that he loved and respected so many of these folks too much really to be, in the position of wanting to, say, humiliate them or really sort of show them in, a less than flattering light. So I think that when he did, sort of inject humor in his works, I think it was always intended to be good-natured.
And when you said misinterpreted, sort of, that was Nan's worry, too, that when she was in American Gothic, people were misinterpreting her role in that picture?
Well, Nan had a very interesting relationship to that painting. I think the older she got, and she lived until the mid-1980s, she so personally associated herself with that painting that any kind of insult to the female character in that painting was taken as a, kind of a personal insult. So when it first came out, someone described in a newspaper the female figure in American Gothic as being the missing link. Another one said that she had a face so sour that it would, turn buttermilk. And these were criticisms of the kind of character and the type that he was portraying. These were not, personal insults to Nan, but certainly Nan took these very seriously. And in fact, in a number of cases, towards the end of her life, she sued certain critics for libel who had created, kind of parodies of American Gothic. And she sued them for personal defamation. So the defamation of her, her own character. But, as I said, that painting has had a very complicated history. And I think many of the early interpretations of it, from the moment that it was first displayed, really missed, I think, the kind of point that Grant Wood himself was trying to make.
I'm guessing that you were born after Nan passed away. Did you ever have the opportunity to meet her?
You flatter me. I was probably going off to college when she died. So I actually do remember seeing Nan when I was in 8th grade. She was being interviewed for something like Good Morning America or some morning program, and she was being hailed as the American Mona Lisa. And I can distinctly remember her being interviewed. This would have been, I don't know, maybe the early 80s or the late 70s. But no, certainly by the time I'd begun my research, she died in 86, and I really didn't start the book until, about the middle of the first decade of the 2000s. So I never did meet her, and I have a sense that it would have been a much more difficult path for me with this project had she been alive. Nan was very proud of the fact that she had sued something like, a dozen would-be biographers of Grant Wood because she really wanted to kind of control the story. So a kind of unfiltered biography of Grant Wood would have been really impossible while Nan was still alive.
You mentioned how Wood went to Paris in the early 20s. So how did his trips to Paris influence his art when he returned to Iowa?
Well, most of the work that he did in Paris was of a purely kind of impressionist style. So he was really painting in what was at that point kind of an old-fashioned painting style in France, which had really undergone a revolution in terms of modernist techniques in the beginning of the 20th century. So he painted sort of in a way that I think he believed reflected what people expected an American expat painter in Paris to paint. He did have a small, very loyal clientele of patrons back in Cedar Rapids, but it really wasn't until he goes to Munich in 1929, 28-29, that his style really changes, and it has nothing to do with French art. He visits the Alte Pinakothek Gallery in Munich and looks at these works by Northern Renaissance painters and, kind of late medieval painters, and has this sort of revelation about painting, in a much more naturalistic manner and in a way that uses costume for dramatic effect and that looks to kind of local landscapes. So I would say that, even though early on, I think he really wanted to be sort of seen as an impressionist painter in Paris, it's really Germany, that short trip to Germany, that changes his style. And that's when he, comes back and paints the portrait of his mother, and then within a year he paints American Gothic.
And then he paints this return from Bohemia, and where all these people behind him with their heads bowed, and he has this perturbed look on his face.
It's true. So Return from Bohemia is a pastel painting. It's a self-portrait. And as you say, he's got sort of all these kind of onlookers behind him. It was intended to be the cover of his autobiography. He had been contracted to write his autobiography in the mid-1930s. And the title of the book itself was going to be Return from Bohemia. And the idea behind that title was that American notions of painters abroad were broadly kind of conceived in terms of bohemia, a kind of wild artistic lifestyle that would be led in Paris or Berlin. And his point with this autobiography was that he had finally sort of rejected a bohemian lifestyle for the much more kind of meaningful landscapes of his childhood back in Iowa. So Return from Bohemia, the image, shows him at an easel with a number of onlookers behind him, some of whom you can really pick out as, his sister Nan as a young girl, his mother, a variety of different types. And you're right, it's a very ambiguous return. What should have been a kind of joyful or, even poignant return to home is shown with him kind of scowling at the viewer and viewers who are not even looking at the painting that he's creating. It's almost as if he's demonstrating to the viewer that the folks back home don't quite appreciate their native son, which actually nothing could have been further from the truth during his own career.
So what kind of relationship did Wood have with his mother and his sister?
Well, I think he felt very protective of his sister because their father died when he was 10 and his sister was really just an infant. I think in some ways he really felt like a surrogate father for Nan. He was extraordinarily close to her and really sort of was involved in all of her life decisions. His mother, he was also quite attached to, and I think for good reason. She was the one who really encouraged him as an artist when no one else in the family had. And he felt that she was, in many ways, like Nan, a kind of muse for his art. So his connection to both of them, I think, was incredibly important, especially during the early part of his mature career. When his mother dies in 1935, he was really kind of anchorless for a while. In fact, he paints very little for about a 3-year period after his mother's death. He was not a prolific painter, especially, again, in that post-1930 phase, sometimes not creating more than, say, 2 or 3 major paintings within a year. And again, after Nan moves out west and his mother dies, I think he really felt the lack of those relationships.
So during Wood's career, he received lots of criticism. Was it justified?
Well, the criticism came from a couple of different places. So as he moved into the latter part of the 1930s, there were a number of American critics who believed that his naturalistic style and his celebration of, American farmscapes was at odds with American modernism, that he was somehow too conservative. On the other side, conservative critics looked at his work and said, his portraits are wonderful, but his landscapes are far too fanciful. They are too mannered. They are too sort of cloying and sweet. So he kind of couldn't win with critics in those two camps. But by and large, he really was quite successful in terms of critical success, in terms of, kind of his popular image. And even, during the Depression, many of his works were going for $5,000 to $10,000 a piece, which was an extraordinary sum for the period. So he was quite successful, even though he really did have to withstand some criticism, both from the right and from the left.
So what do you think about this creative project, the Grant Wood Opera's Strokes of Genius? And what do you feel about this opera that's going to be premiering in Cedar Rapids this weekend?
I cannot wait to see it. I've only seen the libretto so far, but I think it is exactly the kind of thing that Grant Wood himself would have absolutely loved. He had a lifelong association with the theater, beginning as a teenager making sets for theatrical productions. And then later on in the 1920s, he was very involved with the Cedar Rapids Community Players, who actually put on productions within his studio. So even in his living space, he was very interested in this notion of sort of make-believe and theater. And he wrote himself in the fragment of his autobiography that he actually was able to complete. He says that he had an early epiphany as a young boy, this is before his father's death, when one of his aunts took him to see, I think it was a musical version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. He has very little to say about the play itself, but he talks about the revelation of seeing the curtain drawn back on a world of make-believe. So I think that a notion of, converting his own work into operatic and theatrical form would have been something that he would have really delighted in. That notion of kind of visual artifice was something I think really at the heart of his work.
So what do you think is his heart as an artist and as an Iowan, and what do you think his legacy is going to be?
Well, I think that really the heart of his work was a kind of encapsulation and glorification really of his childhood years, a kind of romanticized notion of what Iowa was like in the 1890s. I think that his work was very much about capturing what he later looked back on as a kind of golden age, both for Iowa and for him. In terms of his legacy, I think he's extraordinarily important to Iowa, but I think we do him a disservice to only think of him as a regional artist. I think he is an extraordinarily important modernist and, American figure in American art in the 20th century. And as I said, I think that, we don't really do him any favors by seeing him only as an Iowan or only as someone who is connected to the Midwest. I think these are paintings that give and give. And as you said, about flipping back and forth in the book, as an art historian, I see his works as endlessly kind of fascinating puzzles that give us a sense of him as a person, of him as an artist, and really pushing sort of notions of what it means to be an American. And for that reason, I find his work particularly interesting in a much broader kind of American art aspect.
Do you have any pearls of wisdom you would like to say about Grant Wood, his work, and his life?
Wow. Well, you spend an awful lot of time with someone when you are writing their biography. I guess I would just reiterate that we need to see him through a much larger lens. Works like Parson Weems' Fable or American Gothic, which everyone feels that they know, yield so much more when you look much more closely at them and in the context of his life. So, my pearls would be to look much more closely at his work and to try to better understand the man behind the paintings, because I think too often folks sort of stop at American Gothic. They know very little about the man who created it. And to me, his life story is every bit as interesting as his paintings.
Thanks for today's interview goes to IPR's Phil Moss, Keaton Scoville, Alexis Hahn, and Public Radio's James Baumgartner. And a big thank you to author and lecturer extraordinaire Tripp Evans. And Dr. Tripp Evans is the author of several books, including Grant Wood, A Life. And thank you so much, Tripp.
Thank you so much.
It's been a great honor to have you with us today here on the Iowa Art Showcase, and we're so glad you're in Iowa.
Me too.